upping the top tax bracket.
Taxing billionaires.
Tax the rich.
Tax the rich. Tax the rich.
Over the past decade, the notion of taxing the rich has become a very popular policy narrative championed by progressive center-left politicians. Taxing the wealthy has understandably become quite popular as inequality continues to get drastically worse in most capitalist countries, while the wages of the majority have been stagnant. It's getting so bad that inequality levels are reaching Gilded Age levels, and some even argue ancient Egypt levels. Progressive politicians such as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have played an especially big role in giving this idea even more momentum in recent years. The idea that many social democrats have is to introduce wealth taxes targeted directly at billionaires and multimillionaires, such as higher capital gains taxes, real estate inheritance taxes, closing tax loopholes, and to crack down on billionaires hiding money in offshore tax havens, as well as a top 70% marginal income tax on all income made after $10 million. However, it is no secret that it is quite hard to actually enforce such taxes. Many billionaires with more power and influence will always be able to find ways of storing money in offshore accounts and taking advantage of different tax laws around the world. This is why economists such as Thomas Piketty have advocated for large wealth taxes that are globally enforced by global institutions, which he argues for in his book Capital in the 21st Century, an overly long book that will probably bore you to death. Seriously, just watch his Netflix documentary. Here, I will argue that there are three big problems with the notion of taxing the rich, both as an argument and as a policy solution. Number one, higher taxes on the rich or anyone else are not needed to pay for progressive policies such as a Green New Deal, Medicare for All, federal job guarantee, or basic income. Number two, believing the false assumption that higher taxes are needed to pay for these policies makes it very easy for conservatives to argue against them and block them in government. It heavily convolutes the argument for progressive policies by creating a false sense of dependence on the rich. Number three, taxing the rich is not a sufficient solution for addressing inequality. While taxation can mitigate the symptoms of inequality, it does not address the root cause of inequality, which we'll get to towards the end of the video. Not only does taxation not address the root causes of inequality, but it also does not change the fundamental dictatorial, undemocratic structure of capitalist workplaces, which are alienating, dehumanizing, and restrict human freedom. Now, before getting into the video, if you enjoy this content and consider yourself a fan of the channel, supporting it on Patreon would be a huge step in order to keep this going. The algorithm does not promote this type of content, so if you want to help keep this going, then pledging a few dollars on Patreon to support independent media instead of corporate giants like Netflix would be a huge help. And if you enjoy this content, be sure to check out my second channel, One Dime Radio. Now back to the video. While advocating for more taxation to mitigate wealth disparities is one thing, which economists such as Thomas Piketty argue for, politicians who use taxing the rich as a talking point for how they will pay for their policies is a completely different point, one with a lot of problems. Even though it is an insufficient solution, taxing the rich I can get behind for moral reasons. However, the bigger problem with tax the rich discourse is when progressives naively suggest this policy as a way to fund their policies. Whether it be Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, a federal jobs guarantee, a universal basic income, or even something as rudimentary as building good infrastructure. Isn't it funny how nobody asks how China spends trillions of dollars every year on infrastructure without raising taxes? Progressive politicians who reinforce the myth that we need the money of the rich to pay for these things are just as part of the problem when it comes to economic illiteracy as the pro-austerity deficit donkeys are. And this is because we don't actually need the money of billionaires to pay for these policies. If you watched my previous video on the deficit myth, then you would know that taxes do not actually pay for government spending at the federal level. Taxpayer money is not what pays for the trillion-dollar wars, military spending, stimulus packages, or really anything that the federal government does. Even though it is quite easy to bust the myth once you look a little deep into it, the vast majority of people still think that the government funds their policies via taxation or borrowing money from the rich through government bonds. and this is false. To avoid repeating myself, I highly recommend watching my deficit myth video if you haven't already. And if you are still not convinced, check the sources in the description, as well as these two books on the screen, which are short reads and illustrate the exact technicals of government spending. Contrary to popular belief, the government spends first and taxes second. The federal taxes are not there to finance federal spending, but rather their purpose is to generate demand for the currency, get people working for the currency, and to control the money supply. Federal taxes are not there to generate money for the government. Taxes are there to generate demand for the government's money. Taxation is the primary mechanism that gives value to a state fiat currency. Taxation is how you turn litter and digital blips into money. When the government chooses to issue debt in the form of bonds after spending more money into the economy than it deletes out of it, it does so in order to guarantee people risk-free assets that they can store their money in and collect interest on. In other words, the federal government can always make any and all payments in its own currency. Federal government spending is in no case operationally constrained by revenues. Your federal taxes don't actually fund anything. They get deleted. The federal government both spends money into the economy and deletes money out of the economy via keystrokes at the central bank. Let's take a closer look by seeing what exactly happens if you pay your taxes by writing a check. When the federal government gets your check and it's deposited and clears, all they do is change the number in your checking account downward as they subtract the amount of your check from your bank balance. See, the government didn't actually get anything back to distribute to someone else or to fund anything. No gold coin dropped into the bucket at the Fed. They just changed the numbers in the bank accounts. Nothing went anywhere. And what happens if you were to theoretically go over to your local IRS office to pay your taxes with actual cash? First, you would hand over your pile of cash to the person on duty as payment. Next, he would count it, give you a receipt, and then after you, the taxpayer, left the room, he'd take that hard-earned cash that you just forked over and throw it in the shredder, or burn it. It gets thrown away, destroyed. But how come? Because there's no further use for it. Just like a ticket to the Super Bowl. After you enter the stadium and hand the attendant a ticket that was worth maybe $1,000 or so, he then tears it up and discards it. Can you now see why it makes absolutely no sense at all to think that the government has to get money by taxing in order to spend? In no case does it actually get anything that it subsequently uses. So if the government doesn't actually get anything when it taxes, then how does it spend? Let's say you get a social security check or a COVID relief payment. How did they pay for it? The Treasury gets the central bank to type numbers into a computer and deposit money in your account that you have with your commercial bank. That's it. Okay, now you should know the correct answer to the inevitable question, how are we going to pay for it when it comes to progressive policies? And the answer is, we pay for our policies the same way that the government pays for anything. Your commercial bank has an account with the central bank, the government's bank, the same way that you have a bank account with your commercial bank. To spend, all the government does is get the central bank to type numbers into the necessary accounts. This includes all federal government payments made in dollars. And this includes making interest payments as well as Social Security and Medicare payments, you name it. Seriously, to avoid repeating myself, I would highly recommend watching my deficit myth video if you haven't already. And if you still don't fully get it, there's no harm in watching it again, and exploring the sources in the description for further learning. We shouldn't be using taxing the rich as a response to how will we pay for it. The real question we should be asking is how will we resource it? The physical resources and productive capacity are what actually matter. Money is just a way for the government to get people to do stuff, which other people then pay to other people to do stuff, and the cycle goes on. We have an economy. And when you pay money to get people to build roads, build cities, trains, whatever it is, inflation doesn't automatically happen. Inflation is whether prices rapidly go up continuously, and there are many factors that can cause or prevent that. I'd recommend listening to my podcast on One Dime Radio about inflation with Dr. Philip Armstrong if you want to learn more about that. It's honestly quite funny because Franklin Roosevelt didn't ask how are we going to pay for it when implementing the New Deal, which created Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and a federal jobs program. And the amount of money being deleted by taxes was far less compared to what was being spent. Interestingly enough, taxes were actually cut over time while spending increased, especially in the Kennedy years. Yet the New Deal programs were maintained, and even expanded in the Lyndon B. Johnson years. All the while, the US was spending even more on its military, science, and space exploration to compete with the USSR. And the fact that taxes don't drive government spending was already known by some government insiders before the world went off the gold standard, such as Beardsley Ruml, who served as chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 1940s, during the New Deal era. Chairman Ruml actually wrote a paper in 1946 titled "Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete," which you can find in the description. Now you can see that the evidence is clear and why this isn't really a debatable fact once you actually find out about it. Okay then, so if taxes don't actually fund federal spending, then why do progressive politicians always say that they are going to pay for things by taxing the rich? Well, here's the problem. The vast majority of people have a medieval understanding of economics and have no idea how the monetary system works. Economic illiteracy is widespread, even among the left. There are many politicians who have zero idea how the monetary system works, and some politicians who do know how it works but pretend that they don't, such as Bernie Sanders and AOC. When the media puts politicians like Bernie Sanders and AOC on the spot by asking them how they will fund their big progressive policies, they are often afraid of telling the truth because they will think that they will be torn apart by the media and the misinformed masses. Imagine if they were to actually tell the truth and just simply say, "We will pay for our policies by having the Treasury get the central bank to make the money and deposit it in the appropriate accounts. How will we pay for it? We make the money with keystrokes, just like we do for everything else. How come you guys never ask where the money comes from when it comes to military spending?" Sanders and AOC are afraid of telling it like it is because they don't want the public backlash of people saying, "What? Are these people crazy? Money has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just come from the sky. What do you think, there's a magic money tree? Basic economics, hello. What about hyperinflation? Zimbabwe? Venezuela? Venezuela?" So instead of having the guts to actually tell the truth, AOC and Bernie Sanders appeal to people's basic elementary common sense. They say that the money will come from the rich. And if that doesn't pay for it, we will cut military spending and raise taxes even on the middle class if we have to. While this might be a somewhat understandable rhetorical strategy to avoid short-term political backlash, it has terrible effects in the long run because it reinforces the backward economic illiteracy that misleads the public. And it's quite frustrating, because I know for a fact that Bernie Sanders and AOC do know modern monetary theory. Stephanie Kelton, a known MMT economist and author of The Deficit Myth, was Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor, and AOC even admitted in the past to having studied MMT, and that it should be part of the public conversation. Even though Bernie Sanders and AOC know that their tax policies aren't actually there to pay for their programs, they use their programs as a justification to tax the rich, because they think that the Robin Hood narrative of taking from the rich to give to the poor plays well to people's common sense. But capitulating to economic illiteracy actually has a corrosive impact on political discourse and ultimately shoots the progressive movement in the foot. It's quite hard already to pass legislation like Medicare for All or Green New Deal through government, and by saying that we need to tax X, Y, and Z in order to fund it, you just make the argument for your policy more convoluted and add unnecessary obstacles to it. When progressives connect taxing the rich to social programs, they inadvertently limit what is possible to whatever they can tax out of the rich. By perpetuating this myth, progressives are giving the rich a false sense of benevolence and give them a false sense of control over the government's capacity to provide social programs that people need. Even if it's not the intention, the tax the rich narrative perpetuates the view that without rich people, we can't have nice things, which is just plainly false. Workers make things. People's labor is the real source of value produced in the world. Any policy is possible to implement if there are the physical resources available, being labor and natural resources. The myth of taxpayer money in general also creates resentment between people in the working class, because some working class people will falsely think that their tax dollars are funding welfare programs for the lazy poor. You hear this a lot in America especially. Why should my hard-earned tax dollars fund other people's health care? I don't want my tax money to pay for lazy people on welfare. You could dispel this narrative quite easily just by dispelling the myth that taxes fund government spending. Connecting taxing the rich as a way to pay for progressive legislation also just makes it a lot harder to pass legislation through government. Because if the logic is taken literally, you need to tax the rich first before you can implement the progressive policies, which is an especially hard thing to do in a corporately managed democracy like the United States. You don't need to tax the rich to provide affordable housing. You don't need to tax the rich to fund universal healthcare and education. All you need is the real resources available to do these things. When we do talk about taxation, we should not talk about it in terms of funding things. The discussion should be more shifted towards deterring behaviors that society agrees to be socially damaging. And taxes can be used to reduce inequality, as stated before, but this highly depends on the type of taxes, and even the taxes that do reduce inequality don't actually get at the root cause of it. In fact, certain taxes that we perceive as progressive can actually be regressive, such as corporate taxes. Little known fact, corporate taxes are regressive because in almost all cases, higher corporate taxes just end up being paid indirectly by the corporation's workers or consumers, via wage cuts and price hikes. Furthermore, even though certain taxes such as estate taxes and capital gains taxes can be more effective means of reducing inequality on paper, raising taxes on the top 1% won't automatically make the lives of the 99% any better. No matter how high you raise the top marginal tax rates, capitalists will still control the means of production. They will still control people's working lives. Taxing the rich doesn't actually do anything to rid their control over the means of production and their ability to set wages and prices. When your boss is still treating you like crap, underpaying you, giving you crappy hours, none of this will change whether the boss's tax rate is 10% or 20% higher. Workers need to own the means of production, and we need to collectively own our country's natural resources and services that everybody depends on. If a corporation is evil, whether by destroying the planet, exploiting workers on a mass scale, or both, then you don't tax evil. Nationalize it, make it public property, and allow the public to democratically decide what to do with it. You don't tax Chevron and ExxonMobil to stop climate change. Nationalize them, and then decide what to do with them. Again, while I'm not against taxing the rich as a light reform to mitigate the symptoms of mass inequality, this does not address the root cause of inequality, which is private property. As pointed out a long time ago by prophetic socialists and even early liberal philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's necessary to point out that private property is not the same thing as personal property. Personal property is what you use for personal use. Private property is used for monetary exchange and the accumulation of profits. So no, nobody will make you share your toothbrush or a Ronald Reagan body pillow under socialism. But one of the most visible forms of private property that has a very corrosive impact on society is real estate. When people own multiple real estate properties that increase in value over time, which they are able to rent out for income. Owners of property benefit at the cost of tenants and future homeowners because they seek to continually increase their rent extraction income and the equity value of their property. Capitalist real estate investors also want artificial scarcity in the housing market so that property values can stay as high as possible, which is why capitalist politicians are generally very against public housing programs or rent control. Ironically enough, the commodification of real estate is so dumb and awful for society that even Adam Smith hated it. Yes, Adam Smith, the founder of capitalist economics as we know it, hated landlords and saw no use for them. If we really want to reduce inequality, we need to decommodify real estate by putting a strict cap on how many properties a person is allowed to own. Seriously, who needs more than 2 homes? And why does anybody need to have mansions the size of universities? Or why do rich people need to have huge swimming pools with more water than an entire indigenous reserve? The unequal exuberance of the rich is a decadent, embarrassing waste of resources. Instead of just taxing, we would do a hell of a lot more to reduce inequality by imposing a strict limit on the amount of property someone can own, and implementing an ambitious good quality public housing program, which would drastically lower the values of properties in the real estate market and the amount of rents that landlords can charge. Although I don't think landlords should exist at all, but that's another story. To conclude, stop using the argument that we need to tax the rich to fund social programs. And every time you hear a person use these economically illiterate arguments about taxes or the deficit, just send them my videos, okay? Good. And if they don't get it, send it to them again. Lastly, I would like to thank my patrons. While pledging $5 or $10 a month might be a small amount on an individual level, your collective support can make a big difference in this channel's success. Special thanks to these extra generous patrons who have supported me thus far.